6:02. Why don't we get started? Again, my name's Diana Cassidy. I'm the facilitator for Third Act Sacramento, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our very first meeting of 2024. This is our general meeting, and we invite our membership of about 500 people. Tonight's meeting's a little bit different. Often we talk about our various activities, of which there are many. But we're devoting the entire meeting to a guest speaker, Lawrence McDonald, who's the author of this fabulous book. If you can see it, Am I Too Old to Save the Planet? In fact, we're so excited about Lawrence's work and his thoughtful and encouraging work that we're going to raffle off 3 of the books at just a few minutes before 7 o'clock. So I'll announce the winners of the raffle then. For those of you who are interested and live in the greater Sacramento area, and that includes Davis and Folsom and, far and wide, we do a lot of activities in person and online. And we're having an after party from 7 to 7:30 where you'll hear about our advocacy and voter registration and so on. So I encourage you to stay after 7 o'clock if you're so inclined. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Pat Ferris, who's a founding member of Third Act Sacramento, and he'll introduce Lawrence.
So, hello everybody. I'm just very honored to introduce my good friend and thought partner, Lawrence McDonald, and I'll do so in just a moment. I just want to lay a little bit of ground rules or offerings for everybody. Lawrence is very inspiring. There's going to be all sorts of insights and thoughts and perhaps questions and comments. And so I encourage you to bring those forth. Lawrence said of everything that he wanted, most he wanted conversation and back and forth. So we're going to tee it up so that's possible. And for that to be possible, we want you to bring forth what's on your mind. So how we would like you to do that is that Lawrence is going to talk for a few minutes. Maybe he'll read a little bit from his book. I'll ask him some questions. We'll have a little bit of conversation. Then we'll open up for back and forth and a fuller conversation between everybody who's here and Lawrence. And there are 2 ways for you could be a part of that. One is put a question or a comment in the chat, and Diana is going to be monitoring the chat and will provide those questions or comments to Lawrence, and then he can talk to you directly. The other way is raise your hand and Lawrence will call upon you. So with that, why don't I just tee it up by saying a little bit about Lawrence. So before I knew Lawrence, he was a foreign correspondent. He's also a former vice president of the World Resources Institute. And since I've known him, he's a core member of Third Act DMV, which is DC, Maryland, and Virginia. He's an epitome of a climate activist. I've been at major actions with him in New York City where we walk around a major headquarters of one of the financial institutions, and we can't go more than a few steps without somebody saying, Lawrence, and Lawrence says, da-da-da-da. And then we can't get any farther for an interminable period of time because of Lawrence's relationships. Why Lawrence is here is not only because he's articulate and insightful and will bring forth miracles from our group, but because he's an author of a new book, which Diana just briefly mentioned. It's Am I Too Old to Save the Planet? A Boomer's Guide to Climate Action, which is a way of addressing the kinds of questions that most of us here have. What can we do in our even more limited time to deal with such an intense urgency of such high complexity that has value? And this is what Lawrence addresses. Bill McKibben wrote about the book. This small book is a gem of great value. It will turn more of us older Americans from complainers and worriers into people who are fixing the problems that assail us. It makes a powerful case for generational action. If the kids can do it, so can we. So if you find yourself, as I do, in the camp of a worrier, this is a time to address that, ask it, and explore. So, welcome, Lawrence. Glad you're here.
Thank you for that overly kind introduction, Pat. As we walked around the streets of New York City, plenty of people also came up and said hello to you and know you, and I have learned so much from you and been inspired by your work, and I'm just really delighted to be invited here today.
Well, it's a mutual delightment, isn't it? So, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I want you to go in whatever direction occurs to you. But why don't we start by your saying a little bit about your climate journey? How did you become aware of and committed to addressing the climate emergency?
It's a great question, and I think all of us should practice telling the story of our climate journey. And I've had an opportunity to practice, so I'm going to try and do it concisely. And for me, it really begins with growing up in California. I'm a fellow Californian. I went camping in the giant sequoias with my grandparents, in the high desert with my father. I grew up within bicycling distance of the beach in San Luis Obispo. And for me, the connection with the natural world was always deeply powerful. After I graduated from UCSB, I went to Asia. I studied Chinese. I became a foreign correspondent. And I really immersed myself in understanding global poverty and saw the transformation of Asian societies through development. And then I came back and worked for the World Bank. And I thought of myself as kind of a development person, a person who is interested in reducing global poverty rather than in the environment. But then when I was working for the Center for Global Development, a colleague named Bill Klein wrote a book about the impact of climate change on agriculture. And I was helping in my role as the communications vice president to develop that book. And I remember sitting around a table and feeling like I was in a movie where a scientific finding just foretells disaster, because we're now seeing this with the increases in temperature and the impact on agricultural productivity. And so my interest in poverty reduction and in the natural world came together in that. I then worked for the World Resources Institute, but I increasingly came to feel that the big greens were not achieving what they needed to do, that the climate movement was too polite. And when Bill McKibben called on people to get arrested opposing Keystone XL in front of the White House, I'm afraid that's now been maybe 15 years ago, I was one of those people. And I was introduced to the idea of nonviolent direct action. And that has increasingly interested me. This past weekend, in observation of Martin Luther King's day, I've been rereading the wonderful account of the civil rights movement, Taylor Branch's book, and the tensions between the activists and the centrists and the government, and the way that the activists push things forward. And so that's my journey, and I find myself in the more activist camp. While in the book, I say there are many, many ways that we can go about this. Not everybody needs to be involved in direct action, but for those who are willing, I think it's valuable.
Well, I hope we get into all of those aspects. I'll just say very briefly, and we'll talk about this later. I grew up in San Luis Obispo, so I know where you rode. So we're going to talk about some of that cycling. But passing on from that, um, I'm interested in why you wrote this book at this point. You've been active, you've been thoughtful. Why now? There's so many climate books. Why did you do it? What did
Well,
you
in a
want?
little bit, I'll read an answer to that question, but the short answer is I was inspired by my daughter, who's a national organizer with Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. And I was approaching retirement and I wanted to learn how to be an organizer and I was trying to figure out what I could do. And Muriel said to me, go get your people. It's not for me to organize the young. It's not for me to organize people of color or people in the front line, but there are a whole bunch of people like me, late middle age, middle class, reasonably comfortable, well-educated. Those are my people. And my daughter said, go get them. And I had often thought about climate change through a generational lens. And so that's why I wrote the book.
So listening to the younger generation, we might get some sense of a direction for our own lives.
I think we have a lot to learn from young people, especially young climate activists. Absolutely.
And daughters, maybe.
I learned from my son as well. In fact, I didn't ask them to read the book until quite close to the end. And then they noticed a number of shortcomings that I'm pleased to say that I corrected, that I would have been embarrassed by if I hadn't asked them to look at. Actually, a lot of it had to do with race and class. They were more sensitized to those issues than I was.
Oh. Well, so you mentioned you might read a section of the book. Would you do that for us?
It's so nice, you know. One of the lovely things that Pat is that you wrote this up and said you're going to ask me to read. So it gave me a chance to select this, and this is something I have not read before. It's from the preface, and it explains why I wrote the book. Although there are dozens of books about boomers and hundreds of books about climate change, this is the first to examine the U.S. response to climate change through a generational and a global lens. Part 1 shows how boomers shaped a one step forward, two steps back U.S. policy, and how the resulting lack of U.S. leadership undermined the global response. Part 2, which I would say is actually the last 2/3 of the book, it's not divided in half equally, offers a boomer's guide to action that combines history, research on the climate activism landscape, my own experiences, in interviews with boomer activists.
So you've mentioned that you have had quite an odyssey from looking toward the big greens for solutions, realizing at some point that there may be a need for more direct action. Quite continuum that you followed. I'm often asked by fellow elders and others, what's the most important, most impactful thing that I can do related to the climate crisis? And kind of embedded in that question is my feeling. Almost every day I wake up and I realize that the world is in more of a complex mess than I even thought the day before. In that kind of dilemma, in that kind of life situation, how do you act? And what do you say to someone who is looking for the most impactful thing they can do?
Thanks, Pat. I think most people on this call, and I see we're now up to more than 60, so I'm delighted with that. It's one of the largest groups I've spoken with, are beyond thinking about personal action. But most people that ask me that question, when they say, what's the most impactful thing they can do, they're really talking about their personal consumption choices. And so I have a chapter, it's titled Every Little Bit Helps, right? And I have 6 actions that you can undertake, like installing rooftop solar and buying an EV. And I see there was a question about flying. We could talk about that later. But the main thing I say is don't get stuck at personal action. And so the single most important thing you can do is this: how can I work with others? And that is, working with others is crucial. Assess your strengths, activate your networks, and seek out national organizations to find local connections, which is what everybody on this call has already done. Bonus, have fun, make friends, and bring new meaning into your life. The first part of the book talks about the urgency of the problem, which I think most people on this call understand. The second part is saying that we need very, very rapid system change, by which we mean a rapid end to the fossil fuel era. That's going to require changes in policy, and changes in policy, especially in the face of wealthy, powerful, vested interest in a very imperfect democratic system, is going to require that hundreds of thousands of us mobilize and work together to demand those changes. And there's an entire menu in the book of ways that you could do it. I particularly am fond of Third Act, but for people who are maybe not as comfortable with carrying signs and shouting, maybe a conflict-averse Citizens Climate Lobby, which advocates for a price on carbon and has citizen lobbyists who meet with every single member of Congress privately, including with the Republicans, to discuss things with them. That's also a great path. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got groups like Climate Defiance, a youth-led group that I'm an active supporter of, that infiltrates and disrupts closed-door meetings by the rich and powerful. So there are many, many ways to get involved, but the main thing is find your own people and do that together with others so that you can gain courage and have fun.
Well, let's see what kind of questions might have emerged for people from that kind of provocative introduction that you provided so well.
Can I just say, Pat, I'm very pleased to see that Jim Thompson of This Is What We Did is on the call. He's just introduced himself, and I list a half dozen groups in my book when I say find a group, and This Is What We Did is a small but mighty one that does wonderful work. So nice to have you here.
They really are, and they're a sister organization to Third Act and do incredible work in helping people to refine climate conversations and to develop strategies to move money. Very thoughtful, learning-oriented folks. So thank you for calling that out.
And I see we have somebody here from Elders Action Network as well. So you've got a big tent here. All of these groups are wonderful, and I think it's about finding the group where you're in the best fit. And I have to say the Elders Climate Action is just a wonderful partner for us here in Virginia as well.
So if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand and Lawrence will call on you, or put something in the chat and Diana will read it out for you.
Let me ask a question of the group. I invited people to look up the parts per million of CO2 in their birth year. Most people I see don't have their cameras on. We've got 3 screens. I'm looking at the screen with the cameras on, but there's 2 other screens. But if you had done this before, maybe put a 1 in the chat. And if you've never done this before, put a 2 in the chat. Let's just do a little poll here and see. For whom was this something you knew already? Looks like I'm seeing mostly 2s. So from most people, this was new. Is there somebody who'd done this before who wants to share your experience about this? Why if you thought it was useful? Just go ahead and unmute, share your experience. Or if you did this for the first time, maybe share your experience. What did you think about this? Did this help to make the parts per million number, which can seem very abstract, more personal for you?
Yeah, it did for me. Maureen here, and I know there's a lot of climate scientists who would prefer that we, rather than having a 1.5 marker, that, wow, if we get over that, that instead of using temperature, that we use parts per million, because it's easier to agree on that. I think that number is more solid. It's coming from a place that we can measure more accurately. So, and I had never done this before until I read your book, and I'm like, it's great. Thank you.
Well, one of the things I try and do in the first part of the book is to walk people through the basic science. And I'm always struck, I had to look it up again today before this exercise to remind myself, when was the last time that the Earth was consistently above 400 parts per million for a long period of time? It was 4 million years ago. Sea levels were 30 feet higher than there are today, and there were horses and camels in the high Arctic. So it doesn't mean we're headed there immediately, but it does mean that if we don't stop emitting carbon and find a way to bring it down, that's the place that we're going to wind up. And I find that very sobering. And I also find it very sobering to realize this happened on the boomers' watch. And people say to me, don't make me feel guilty. Guilt is not a good place to operate from. I understand that. But I do think that all the world's religions teach, and AA also teaches, that in order to be at peace with ourselves, we need to understand the responsibility and the harm that we have caused. And it doesn't mean that we individually caused this, but collectively, our generation, as the most powerful generation in the most powerful country in the world, failed in important ways. And for me, that drives me forward every day to say, okay, I have a responsibility now to make this a priority and to do everything I can to try and set things right. I think there must be questions or comments.
Yeah, there's actually, Lawrence, there's a question in the chat. And it is, what is our best response to people who say or feel that it's too late? So what do we do, not about climate anxiety, but about despair?
You know, I think despair is a real problem. It's a problem for me every single day. There are people, including Rebecca Solnitz, her new book, It's Not Too Late, which I have here on my shelf, who have written wonderfully about this. I find that, interestingly, women writers tend to be better at this than male writers. I think men maybe are a little bit more on the doomer side. But I think that we know that we can make things less bad, significantly less bad. We can't reclaim the gentle climate that we had in our youth, but if we work together, we can delay catastrophe. And there's an analogy I think of, which is perhaps extreme, but maybe not, is that, you know, if we think back to the Holocaust, many of us think if we were there and we had the chance to act, that we would have done something to try and stop the genocide of the Jews and other people. I don't think any of us would have said, well, they've already killed 3 million, so it's too late. There's no sense acting. If we could have saved another 3 million or 10 million, we would have done that if we were in the position to take that kind of action. And I think that we are in a situation now where millions of people are going to be displaced. And when we say displaced, it probably means they're going to die. A lot of them are going to die. They don't have anywhere else to go. They're not going to have food to eat. But there's a difference between tens of million and hundreds of million. There's a big, big difference. And that's where we find this existential fight. I'm sorry, that's a little bit grim, but I think that we're all adults. And I think that one of the problem with the big greens, and I was the head of communications for one of the biggest of the big greens, has been the unwillingness to speak frankly, adult to adult, about the nature of the stakes that we face.
Thank you. I think that's a really honest answer. And there are some terrific comments in the chat, like how older people can be a moral force. So I think that's wonderful. And someone shared your link, Define the Parts Per Million by Birth Year, to his Democratic Club and some other organizations. So what a great conversation starter. Another question that's come up is, can you discuss why nonviolent direct action is important to you?
It's important to me because of my reading of history and the power of nonviolent direct action as a lever for change. And in the towards the end of my book, in the chapter "Who You Calling Radical," I cite a couple of writers. Andreas Malm. Some of you will have read his book called "How to Blow Up a Pipeline," which is not really a how-to manual. It's why it's necessary to have a radical flank, but it's got a provocative title. And Eric McBay, who has written a 2-volume tome called "Full Spectrum Resistance." And they both recount the history of major social justice movements. Eric McBay in greater detail than Andreas Malm, but they cite the same examples. The civil rights movement, the suffragettes movement, going back further, Gandhi's movement for the independence of India. More recently, the ACT UP AIDS activists. In each instance, there was a radical flank that engaged in nonviolent direct action to challenge authority. And they created space in which the moderates could then negotiate. And I think that the climate movement up until now has not had a radical flank. And so you have people like Bill McKibben, God bless him, a wonderful leader and a wonderful writer, and he winds up feeling like the far left flank because there's hardly anybody who's famous who is to the left of Bill. When I say the left, I'm using that broadly to say is more insistent, more disruptive than Bill. We now have that in groups like Declare Emergency, Just Stop Oil, and Climate Defiance. And I think it is creating space in which groups like Third Act and even Citizens Climate Lobby can begin to negotiate. So I consider nonviolent direct action to be a very important tool in the tool chest.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think I'll take a risk and say that's a tool that we really need to develop. Nonviolent direct action. We haven't quite gone there, but we can talk more about that. There is another question in the chat, which is, what would you say about the impact of the wars occurring, and what specifically what impact will they have on the environment?
It's a really good question. It's not one in which I have expertise. I saw recently there was a study about the climate impact of the Gaza war, and people were objecting to that, saying the war in itself is a terrible tragedy. Some people would say a genocide, and we don't need to be looking at the climate impacts of that. War is a terrible, terrible thing. It's terrible for the environment. As we said in the 60s, it's not healthy for children and other living things. If we're going to wait to address climate until we end wars, it'll be too late. So I prefer to try and focus on the pieces of climate policy that I think are within the realm of things that I could change. I'm also anti-war. I attend anti-war protests, including the Ceasefire Now protests. But one person can't do everything. So I don't know that trying to quantify, and maybe the question isn't asking for quantification, but I'm not sure that trying to quantify the contribution of war to climate change is necessarily that important an exercise, because it is so terrible in its own right that we obviously should be doing all that we can to end all wars everywhere.
Thank you. For the audience, if you have questions, feel free to speak up. You're a little shy and you're using the chat, and I'm happy to read your questions if that's how you're comfortable. But does anyone want to
It's so
talk?
interesting, Diana, because I've done maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 of these talks. And Pat said, you know, this group's a little shy. They're not going to ask questions. I was like, sure, they will ask questions. But now y'all are proving me to be wrong. I want you to prove Pat wrong. I see Mark. Somebody named Mark Roast has got his hand up. Thank you, Mark. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. I got 2 posts up here in the chat. Garl Purovitz is defining an economic paradigm. He has the New Economy Coalition, and he was the guy who tried to, he was in the union and he tried to get the the steel plant in that one city that was going to be shut down. And so he said, let's have the union, let's have the workers open it up again. And he almost got there, but there was some backdoor stuff that sabotaged it. But he's been working, I just heard recently, he's one of my heroes. I just heard recently that they have been doing very, very in-depth economic analysis of how to move forward in a sustainable way. Our company, Sustainable Energy Inc., is developing disruptive technologies that should be profitable enough to scale like mad and to finance other changes in economies. So if we go in and we all of a sudden pull the rug out from fossil fuels in, let's say, a developing economy, now they no longer have to spend a chunk of their cash to buy fossil fuels, and the savings can be used to pay off the financing. But we can also, because it'll be so profitable, we can, in terms of comparison with the other technologies that we're up against, we expect to be able to finance things like the computers and the lab refrigerator and stuff like that would take for a village to get itself organized and come up with a value-added technology, which might be just crop processing and it might be something else, so that they're not at mercy of the traders who come in and say, as a guy from a herding culture in Kenya, who was a Stanford Digital Vision Fellow, told me and Joy Tang and some other people that when he and his brother tried growing potatoes, when the potatoes were ready to harvest, the buyer came out and said, I'll give you $2 for 200 potatoes in a bag. You can take my $2, or you can either watch your potatoes rot in the ground or turn green above the ground. Now in Idaho became the potato state because the ranchers and the farmers who are in the same position, merchants have been doing the same thing to them. They took dry wash gullies and they put pine trunks over them, and they covered that all with hay. Put a door at the top and bottom.
Where are you going with this?
I'm just wrapping it up.
Good.
I'm just wrapping it up. Like one more sentence, please. Okay.
Please
so
go ahead.
They put hay over it and door at the top and door at the bottom. Now they have a root cellar with first in, first out inventory management. They let the potatoes at the bottom, take a wagon load into market and sell them at a market price, and tell the buyer to take a long walk off a short pier.
Let me answer what I think is your question. Technology is our friend. We need much better technologies, and some of them are like your potato example. They're, we used to call appropriate technologies, small scale technologies. Some of them are quite big technologies, but the power and vested interest of the fossil fuel lobby is so great that even though, as Bill McKibben constantly points out, solar is now much cheaper than oil and gas, and getting cheaper all the time, they're not about to give up their power, and they benefit from massive subsidies. So I think technology alone can't do it, which is why we need to organize. So I would leave it there. I see Kent has got his hand up.
Yeah, I agree with you. Actually,
Kent, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt the previous questioner though. So, well, anyway, all right. My question is this. I was either reading in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times the other day that, one of the problems with sustainable solar power and wind power is that it's so cheap. And it's so cheap, in fact, that in our private market system, people don't want to invest in it because they can't make the kind of profits that the oil company can charge, because they're developing or they're selling a very highly processed commodity. What do you think about that? I mean, I always wonder about, a lot of these things that need to happen have to happen at least to a certain degree in the context of the free market. And so the question of the profitability becomes a key question in terms of people investing in a new technology. And so if solar's cheap and you can't sell it for very much, and that's like what's so wonderful about it, then how do you get around the incongruity of it being not a desirable investment vehicle?
Ken, thanks for that question. I'm not an economist, but I worked for 10 years at the World Bank. I worked with economists a lot, and I know that there are sticking points in any kind of a transition. I'd have to see more research about that. I wouldn't have thought that the problem necessarily is that it's too cheap. I think that there are other more obvious problems, which are the entrenched power of the existing interest and their ability to capture both political power and subsidies. Cheap energy is pretty attractive. There ought to be ways to make money, but it probably is not going to enrich those who are currently being enriched by fossil fuels. So I think it's more of a question of power and distribution rather than the absolute price level. But it's an interesting argument. It's one that I'd like to look into more. But I think that cheap solar energy is probably our friend in general, and the entrenched political power and the ability to capture massive subsidies is where I would tend to focus our attention. Diana, I saw some pretty interesting questions in the chat. I know you've been looking at them. I can't quite read them and think and listen at the same time, but is there one that you would maybe want to lift up?
Sure. And I'm not going in order here, so I apologize. I just think this question raises such an important issue that we just can't address often enough. So this is someone who's talking about quitcarbon.com. So feel free to go there. There's a really nice long explanation of how they help people change their houses from carbon users to non. So for example, an electric stove and things like that. So the writer says, my question is, how do you, Lawrence, feel about the relative priority of getting fossil fuel out of each of our homes versus other things we might spend our time and money doing?
It's a great question, and it goes to this chapter, every little bit helps, right?
Yeah.
I did all 6 things in that chapter, including installing rooftop solar and buying an EV and moving my savings out of fossil fuels in the year that it took me to write the book. So I think those are good things to do. Part of the reason they're good to do is I then felt kind of liberated. It's like, okay, I checked that box. Now what am I going to do? But if somebody says to me, I don't think I have the time or the energy or the money to do both, reducing my own footprint or organizing, I would say, don't worry about your footprint. The carbon footprint was invented by British Petroleum, as I describe in the book, to make us feel guilty for our personal consumption choices. And it's much more important to focus on what we can do collectively. That said, I've got a methane furnace in my house. As I learn more about the health impacts of methane, I'm eager to get rid of it. It would also be one less methane burning device. And so I'm going to be looking into the subsidies made available under the Inflation Reduction Act. And if my furnace went out tomorrow, I'd be installing a heat pump. So I don't think that it's either or, but given the choice, I would focus on collective action rather than personal action.
So I have 2 questions, actually a comment and then a question, Lawrence. First is about the heat pump for HVAC. Raylene and I just found out via Maureen that we could get an HVAC heat pump a hot water heater installed basically for free because of the rebates. So I just want to voice that because anybody on this call should take advantage of that right away. There's a limited amount of funds in that available, and so we really should be moving on that real fast. My question, I want to dig a little bit more into your discussion of nonviolent direct action as a tactic or strategy that is worth our considering. There are a lot of people who are really concerned that NVDA in their minds is inappropriate in this culture in most instances because it creates backlash in their minds, and that it polarizes people. What do you say to that concern?
I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, I spent the weekend reading this wonderful book about the civil
Yeah, it's
rights
a good
movement,
book.
and in particular, the chapter called Baptism on Wheels and the Freedom Ride Summer. And it describes in fascinating detail the interaction between the young freedom riders who insisted on getting on these buses and going into the Deep South in interracial groups at great personal risk. I did not realize the numbers of them who were taken off the buses and beaten extremely. We know the 3 who were killed, that gets recited a lot, but the large numbers of other people who were beaten very badly, but also the fact that Dr. King initially didn't think that this was a good idea. And a lot of people in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference thought this is going to create, a backlash against us, and counseled against it. And the dynamic between these people engaged in the nonviolent direct action, the somewhat less radicalized civil rights leaders, and then Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General in the administration, and then John Kennedy as president. And the people on the freedom buses drove stuff forward. They called national attention to a terrible, terrible injustice, and they made progress in a way that would not have happened if they hadn't had done that. But it was contentious, even within the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. People weren't sure what to do. So I think one of the things we sometimes forget is that movements are really messy. And there was a really nice question in here. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull it up about, how do I feel about diverse groups versus one group, and having one way to go forward versus a lot. And, it was Mao Zedong who said, let 1,000 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools of thought contend. And I think we need that in the climate movement. We don't know what the solution is, and people should do the thing that calls to them. And it's okay that it's a bit messy. And it's okay that there are a lot of groups out there and they come together in various kinds of coalitions. The one thing I would say is I will never criticize somebody who's doing something about climate action. I just don't think it's in our interest to fight among ourselves. If somebody wants to spend their time talking to Republicans behind closed doors, it's not my cup of tea, but God bless them for doing that. I don't think there's any bad way to go about this. We should not fight among ourselves. We should have lively discussions about the best way forward, and we should form coalitions. But I think the overall problem is that the level of effort is not yet commensurate with the problem.
So we need to step up and act. We need to get out of our comfort zones. We need to move forward commensurate with the urgency of the situation. That's what I hear implied by what you said.
Get out of your comfort zone in particular. I see 2 hands up. One is from Avis, and then there's Wendy. Your camera's not on, Wendy, but I can see your hand. Avis, did you have a question or comment?
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us. I wanted to mention, I don't know if you've heard of that Modern Elder Academy. It's run by Chip Conley. He ran the Joie de Vivre Hotel Group, and he joined Airbnb, was kind of the oldest person there. And I think he'd be great to speak there. And I was thinking in this theme of education, of how to do direct action, I attended the anniversary of Third Act, and Bill McKibben was talking about some classes he's going to be starting for that. But I did attend my first action, which I'm embarrassed to say it was my first, because I'm 61. I did it like a year and a half ago. But there is a lot to learn. And I think when you're new at it, it's just, you're like a deer in the headlights. And one thing I learned that I didn't know was just how much, and this is like direct action 101, but I didn't know it, that being white and of a certain, you know, whatever it would be, and it certainly would be powerful being someone that's older like myself, that you have a certain ability to protect people when things are happening. And so it's things like that that you learn as an ally for things that are going on, that if you don't, so I'm looking forward to the classes. If someone has the information, they get posted tonight, but if not, I'll keep an eye out in the email. So thanks for letting me share. And thank you so much. Sorry, there really wasn't a question in there, except you should teach. Will you teach at the Modern Elder Academy?
Well, I'd love to know more about the Modern Elder Academy. Perhaps you can send that to me. I'll put my email in the chat. And you said it better than I could about the utilizing the power and privilege that many of us have to protect others. I think that that's a really important point. Finally, I'll say that I think Bill has done at least one of these trainings. They're recorded. They're online at the Third Act website. And I wasn't able to watch the first one. I plan to go back and watch it and to do the other two. And I know that Third Act is getting ready to call on elders across the country to use these skills. And I'm very grateful that he's teaching these courses. I see a hand up from somebody who's identified as Wendy Chioni.
This is Chris, Wendy's husband. She's over here trying to clip our beagle's toenails. But I just wanted to make a comment that might be helpful for the general audience, and that is the way that the conversation is framed. I don't know that many people, I don't know that it really is understood, or the magnitude isn't really conveyed the way things are described. For example, when they talk about 1.5 degrees C, it's a small number, and people might think, well, you know, the temperature is 100 degrees, and if it's 101.5 or in Fahrenheit, so it'd be about 103, what's the big deal? One way to put it in a different context would be our body temperature is 98, and if we were 3 degrees warmer, I don't think we'd be feeling so good. So that's sort of one example. Another would be when we talk about CO2, parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. Most people, unless you have a science or an engineering background, they're just lost with that. When emissions are tallied, they're done in pounds and tons because they are physical and they have that characteristic. And people can relate to a ton probably better than they can to a ppm, and the idea that we're essentially, we live in a snow globe, so whatever gets pumped out doesn't escape to outer space. It's just there, and we just keep filling the balloon more and more. So I think to the extent that we can simplify these things and put them in terms that people can more easily understand, the better it is to make some of the other arguments. So that's all I wanted to say.
Great suggestions, Chris. I did my best in the beginning of my book, and different measures work differently for different people. I think that I like your idea of the body temperature as an example, that a couple of degrees in body temperature, and maybe our Earth is also like an organism, you know, a couple of degrees difference in the Earth also makes for fuel a sick planet.
Yeah, and I wasn't it wasn't a critique on your book. It's just
No, I
general...
understand that. I understand that.
So
I guess what I'm saying is to try and convey this complex science in a way that touches people is a real challenge. But I think that one thing we're seeing, I mean, today I saw, you know, video of floods in Maine. This is not the time of year that Maine is supposed to be having a lot of rain. It's supposed to be getting a lot of snow. So as these impacts come closer and more extreme and more frequent, I think a lot of people are coming to understand.
Lawrence, there are two questions. One's from Goli and one's from Ruth. And I'll ask each of them in turn, maybe starting with Goli. Please ask your question or make your comment.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It's all right.
I wrote it down. So I wanted to say that I was uplifted when I heard, I think Raylene sent me the video about what the Dutch people did with repeated and escalating demonstrations, and they forced their government to stop fossil fuel subsidies. So what I was going to ask you is, are there any national groups focused on this specific strategy? And if not, what do you think about this as a focus for climate action?
I also really admire what has happened in the Netherlands, and I think that one of the shortcomings of our national media is that they are not reporting on these kinds of successful actions. They're not even reporting on the successful campaigns here in the United States. There's a lot of horse race coverage, the amount of ink spent on the Iowa caucuses. The caucus, they could take 10% of that and cover what's happened in the Netherlands. I think focusing on fossil fuel subsidies is a great idea. I know that it has been a consistent part of the narrative that has been talked about in the climate community. I'm not aware of any campaign currently right now, Goli. Maybe others are that I'm not aware of. But I think one of the lessons that we can take from the Netherlands is that a consistent large-scale campaign can win results. Here in Virginia, our Virginia Third Act group is reading George Lakey's book, How We Win. I've just read the beginning of the first several pages of that. It's, I think, incredibly clear when George writes about protests don't get you very much, campaigns do. They need to build over time. And I hope that that's what we in Third Act are going to be preparing to do, to launch campaigns. And a group like Third Act Sacramento, with your several hundred people on the list and 60 people willing to come and hear me, and you've got a lot of knowledge and a lot of power in that group, and I'll be very excited to see what you all do.
So Ruth, did you have a question or a comment for Lawrence?
Yes, and thank you so much. Really inspiring. But one area that sort of think about is you've got the people power. And Bill McGibbon in a recent newsletter article talked about the insurance industry and how they're just like, oh my God, what do we do? We've got to raise prices. And so how do we get big business, which is affected by all of this just as much, to sort of at least to get engaged, because really they're the ones with a lot of power, and I think would create a incredible momentum if there were some major businesses that just said, wait a minute, this is all going to affect our profits and our bottom lines, and we need to get engaged now. How does that happen?
It's a really good question, Ruth. My former employer, World Resources Institute, WRI, is very focused on what they called win-win-win solutions. That is, ways that companies could be even more profitable, could do good things for the environment and do good things for society. And, I must have edited a dozen reports with great ideas about how this could happen. My sense is that there will be a small number of companies that will do this, but the really big money and big power is pretty comfortable doing what they're doing, which is why I'm no longer devoting my time and energy to promoting those win-win-win solutions. I think it really comes down to power. Those of us who want to protect the planet and a livable planet and a socially just society, to challenge those entrenched interests. I don't think we're going to, I believe in the market. I believe a lot in carbon pricing. I part ways with many of my friends on the left who don't believe in carbon pricing. I believe a lot in market forces, but market forces have to be guided by sound regulation, and sound regulation has to come out of a political process. So I don't know if that gets to your question or not.
Well, I think it's sort of, we're focused on the political process, but business, and particularly big business, is so supremely influential. It's all right, then how do we get them to move the needle as well, so that, they're just not this, okay, no, everything's fine. And of course, they're far more influential in many cases on the political process than the individuals.
One of the things that has disappointed me a lot is that the billionaire class has not used its huge wealth and power, even though any one of them alone could have made a big difference. And the biggest climate grants yet announced were Jeff Bezos's 10 billion, of which he quickly gave $1 billion. But that's just a rounding error for somebody like Jeff Bezos. It's not serious money, and he has not deployed it in the way that he could. So I find that, puzzling and disappointing that the most powerful people in our society and the wealthiest are not using their resources to rescue the planet.
Well,
So it's up to us.
Yeah, I guess so. Thank you.
I see we're coming up on the hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time. Diana or Pat, should we be wrapping up? I want to have a chance to thank everybody.
Yes, I think this is a perfect time, and apologies to those of you who didn't have your questions answered, but I think we have some great folks we can talk to. And Lawrence, thank you. This has just been such a wonderful way to spend our general meeting for the first part of 2024, and I think you gave us a lot to think about.
Well, thank you, Diana. I really appreciated the chance to speak with you. I hope that many of you will be inspired to get a hold of my book. I put in the chat, you don't have to buy it. Write to your library, ask them to get a copy. If you'd like to buy it, it's available. You can ask your favorite local independent bookstore. Of course, you can also order it online from Amazon or Barnes & Noble. If you do order it from Amazon, please write me a review. That helps to spread the word. I wrote the book not because I wanted to write a book, but because I wanted to have conversations like this. And the book has been an opportunity for me to do that. And so I just really appreciate you all having me here today.
So that's the perfect segue to announce the raffle. I randomly selected 3 of the participants, so I'm going to call your names, and if you could private message me on the chat. I can also look you up in on the reservation sheet, but just to be sure I have your email address, because I'm going to need to get your mailing address to send you a physical copy of the book. And so drum roll, the winners are Don Rhodes, Francesca Wander, and Trina Lee. So congratulations, the 3 of you. Yay. Bravo. Okay. I know some of you have to go at 7 o'clock, but for those of you who want to stick around, we'll tell you about what we're doing here at Third Act SAC and how you can get involved. So if you need to log off, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll probably start in 30 seconds or so for the folks who
And
want to
Diana,
stick around.
thank you to the people who have put lovely, appreciative comments in the chat. For some reason, my right-click mouse isn't enabling me to put hearts and thumbs up on these, but I read them and I appreciate them, and I thank you for the encouragement and kind comments.
All right.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. And it's now 10 o'clock, your time, I think. So feel free to log off if you want to. And
I think I'm going to log off, not because it's late, but because then those of you who are still on the line can say, what the hell was that all about? Thank you, Pat and Diana and
Thank you,
Maureen. I look
Lawrence.
forward to seeing you here in DC soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, soon. Okay. Bye-bye. Wow.
Boy, that was just delightful. Thank you, Pat, for organizing that.
You're very, very welcome.
That format was great. I really appreciated the format. It was very airy in a way. It kind of gave space for, I think, a lot of people that might not have written or, asked questions or you know, it was really quite wonderful. Thanks, Pat.
Yeah, I love to talk with Lawrence and debrief with him. He got questions from all sorts of directions, and knowing him, I bet he's pretty exhilarated by that. So
Give him 3 words for me. Bravo, fantastic, wonderful.
okay, I'll give him bravo, fantastic, wonderful. I'll remember that clearly and pass it on.
Can
You know,
you
I-
guys send the chat to him so that he can see all the parts of it?
Now that's a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
because he
can do
wasn't
that.
looking at the chat, he was looking at us.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saved the chat. I mean, I normally do, but I'll send it to him. That's a great question.
Thank you.
That's fabulous. Good
So,
idea.
okay, so someone just asked me privately, what's the name of the organization that hosted this event? And we're Third Act Sacramento. And you can find us if you dig around on thirdact.org.
Did anybody remember what the name of the book by Eric McVeigh, the tome on nonviolent direct action that he mentioned? He showed it, but I couldn't catch it.
It's
Yeah, it was full spectrum resistance.
right.
Okay, thank you.
Diana, this is Ruth. I think that, I mean, one of the most valuable things, it was very interesting, but one of the most valuable things I think is that tool where you can see how the parts per million have increased during your lifetime. It's such a terrific visual. I sort of thought to myself, boy, you know, we ought to really utilize that far and wide and let people know, because I mean, I was astonished that, you know, it's gone up 105 times. Because that's sort of like, you know, as somebody said, 1.5. I mean, what does that really mean? Though I like the temperature, it still sounds small, but when you see this is how it was when you were born versus now I'm 65, then it just sort of hits you, the enormity of it. I think I'd love to sort of start presentations and talks distributing that and saying to people, all right, first thing you need is check this out.
And we can start out by saying, hey, look what we did. We are guilty. Now let's get to work.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
Kent, you have your hand up?
No.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay? I think
Yeah.
yeah, okay. It's funny, I've been thinking about this. I've been involved in a couple direct action things with you guys, and I've also been working with a consortium of different environmental groups on the county's climate action plan. And that hasn't been direct action. I mean, it is in the sense that we go and show up at, you know, county board meetings and testify. And I was kind of comparing at least my gut reaction to and actually what I've seen about the success of either or both. I mean, I didn't hear anybody talking about interacting directly with the government, you know, like locally, for example, at a board meeting, testifying, putting pressure on representatives and things like that. And you know, it's like we've been working on pressuring the county with the climate action plan for almost 3 years now. And thanks primarily to Oscar Balaguer, who is like a mean barnacle that you just cannot get off your ass. I mean, he's just there. But with the rest of us too, we just stayed on the county and stayed on them for years. And they looked the other way. They tried to ignore us. They blew us off. They did all this stuff. And a couple months ago, they actually conceded the 12 points that we were hitting them on as far as verifiability, doing a new EIR, doing all kinds of stuff that really did need to happen. And so we considered that to be quite a success. And one of the reasons the success was there was because we testified and went to these county meetings. We got young people to show up to them. We had, you know, some pretty effective evenings, and we had county supervisors publicly going against what their official position had been in the meeting, because during those meetings, if you get up and you do the right things, you can really change things. It's a great opportunity to change things. And so I just wonder, the direct action things, I think, make people feel good. They're out in the street, they're doing something. I don't know that direct action against commercial interests has any effect, or I shouldn't say it has any effect. I don't know that it does or not. I do know that direct action in environmental governmental bodies like the city council or the county board of supervisors, that does have effects. And
Thank you, Ken.
it's like people get bored with that because they don't want to sit through a long meeting, but that works.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I guess I have a few thoughts. One is it's exactly what we need to hear, that our time is well spent, that we do have wins. Third Act submitted a 3-page, very detailed letter criticizing the county cap maybe 6 or 8 months ago, and thanks to Lori Littman for her knowledge on that. But yeah, I know several of us have been to those county board meetings, and
Yeah.
I think what you're highlighting is that there are so many ways to get involved in climate activism. And that's really what the next 20 minutes or so of our meeting is about, is if you don't want to go out and protest with signs or dress up like a bee, like I've done, which is an endangered creature because of climate change in part, there are other things you can do, and advocating with local and state legislature is one of those ways. So I'm going to call on various team leaders in Third Act Sacramento now, so they can tell you very briefly ways you can get involved, and I'll put their email contact in the chat so you can contact them. So since you were just talking about legislation, I'm going to call on Ruth to tell us about SB 252.
Hi, everybody. So SB 252, in a word, calls upon PERS and STRS to divest from fossil fuels. We can't, per the Constitution, require them to, but certainly I think it would send a huge message if the California legislature and the governor signed a bill that says that they should divest. And there's a really important piece that's happening for sort of the Sacramento region, and that's Assembly Member Stephanie Wang, who represents 8010, which includes Elk Grove and a lot of the surrounding area. She is on the PERS committee, and so the bill has passed through the Senate and is now in the second house in the Assembly. And the bill last time was killed. It never got out of Assembly PERS, that's Assembly Public Employees Retirement Systems. And so it's never gotten out of Assembly PERS. And so we really need as many people who are in her district to be meeting with her and writing her and calling her. So please let me know if you want to get engaged in that campaign. That would be great. We met with her, a couple of Third Act people and some others. We met with her in November, just sort of laid out what we thought was at stake. And she listened and was engaged, but she certainly didn't commit to anything. So she needs to hear from her constituents.
Thank you, Ruth. Lori Littman's also involved in the county cap and a mayoral meeting coming up that's for the city of Sacramento. Lori, did you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I just would like to encourage everybody to sign up for the mayoral candidates forum. We have 3 of the main candidates have confirmed it's going to be on January 22nd, next Monday. via Zoom. And so we'll hear from Dr. Flo, Dr. Pan, and Assembly Member Kevin McCarty. And this will be specifically focused on climate justice. So we have some good questions for them that they can't just say yes and no. And we'll see if they can distinguish themselves around who is the best climate justice candidate. And that will be in our newsletter.
Thanks. And anyone who's not registered for the newsletter, just put your email in the chat and I'm happy to add your name. So actually, before we move on, I just want to give a quick shout out to Elders Climate Action. They were absolutely essential in sending a notice for this talk and this meeting out to 3,000 of their members across Northern California. So deep bows to you. And there's a good note in the chat. I encourage you to read that. As you know, we just want people to get involved. Join Third Act, join Elders Climate Action, 350 SAC. There's so many ways to get involved. So let me turn to Mary Ann, who's doing some really interesting work with voter registration.
Okay. Hi. Yes, Third Act Sacramento has a really lively senior to senior campaign ongoing. And this is part of the general campaign of Third Act nationally to support democracy. And our senior to senior group goes in as volunteers into government classes, which is the 12th grade curriculum in high school. We go into these public and private high schools to give a pep talk to the students about being a bona fide citizen now that they're turning 18, what the rights and responsibilities are of citizenship, and how voting is such a seriously important aspect of being an American. And we feel that it gets across a couple of things. Number one, that active citizenship, such as we are doing in their classroom, is important. And also, if you don't have the time or means to be active in your community, that just the simple act of voting is the minimum and so important to overcome the moneyed interests that are in politics. So we really bring that point forward. Then we have them fill out the registration form to become voters. And right now we are engaged with the county, who is providing mock elections in high schools. These are happening inside of multi-purpose rooms and cafeterias and bigger places than the classroom itself. And they are using Marvel characters as electors, as those to be elected. I was hoping they were going to be doing a real mock election, but they didn't want to make up ballots that were not usable in the future, in future years. So they're using fictitious characters, which is okay as long as the students are familiar with them. And so we have 16 events this month that we are involved in different high schools. And we do the filling out the form aspect. So once the students have received their ballot to vote for one of these Marvel characters, then they come to our table and we register them to vote. And the problem, though, is that at least it sort of certifies my feeling that going to the classroom is the better method, is that it's really hard to catch these kids as they're leaving their ballot box, and we cannot catch all of them. So we've been getting like 5, 6 registrations at a high school, whereas before we could pick up 100 to 150 registrations at a high school in a day. So our method is far more effective, but the county they superimpose themselves onto what we were doing. And with, it's good to have a mock election, but they did that so that we then were not able to go to some of these schools because the schools were already committed to the mock election with the county. So we couldn't really go into their classrooms and do it because we'd be doing the same thing. So we decided to help them. At least we could be a presence that way. And that's what we're doing this month. But come February, we will be going back into the classrooms and March. And of course, the primary is on March 5th. And we're trying to just get as many kids voted because we know that in the last election, 2022, they had a real effect as far as the voting public goes and impacting elections and changing some of the people who were elected into a more progressive format of, you know, a slate of candidates that were elected. So that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, or my name and email, I think, is going in there, as Diana said she would. So contact me and I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. I just think that's so exciting that you're going out to the local high schools and you're seeing a lot of interest. I mean, you've registered hundreds of students so far. So we just have 3 more announcements. You can tell we're a very busy group. We have a lot going on. So we're going to go in this order: Goalie, Pat, and then Luke. So Goalie, tell us about your exciting events.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there with us. So January is pretty busy. Today we all marched in with the Third Act banner in the MLK March, and worked on getting some signatures for a climate initiative while we're there. If you're interested this week, you can help us with the Costco campaign. We've been nationally, I guess, Third Act has been gathering petitions for Costco to drop their credit card bank, Citi, which is the second largest funder of fossil fuels and the worst one for coal. And we're asking them to do the right thing because that's what's in their mission and vision, to do the right thing. And we're asking them to. So we're going to be on this Thursday, the 18th. We're going to be delivering the list of 40,000 petitions of signatures to the manager at Exposition Boulevard, Costco. And so you have a chance to help with in the comfort of your own home. And we're calling it the Costco Couch Flash Mob. So while we're going in, because they want us to do it really quietly, not to disturb anybody, because otherwise we'll get thrown out. We have it. Lori just sent it out. It's we have the link for you. You can help us by sending a comment to their customer comment line. And this is, hopefully you can do it sometime in the morning. And you just go, and there's a little talking points in the newsletter that she just sent out that says, hey, you can just say, do the right thing, get rid of Citi. So that's very simple that you can do. If you have time next week, we have an exciting, as Ruth mentioned about the SB 252 for divesting CalPERS and CalSTRS from fossil fuels. We have a potluck and a watch party. It's going to be, it's a hybrid event. So you can either come and have food with us it's going to be at the 350 Sacramento office. And the address is 909 12th Street in downtown Sacramento. It'll also be hybrid, so you can listen in. It starts from 5 to 8. I think dinner will be between 5 and 6, and then it'll be Bill McKibben and about 6 other activists, local or California activists, who are working on this campaign. And then there'll be time for questions. And I know there's other groups like Elder Climate. We invite you guys to join us to either in either format. We'd love to have you, and any other group that's here. And then the third thing this month, as if we don't have enough, the details of these are not that clear. So I'm going to ask Diana to please put Pat's email in the chat for me. Actually, I think I just put it in. Yeah. And so basically this is going to be, we're restarting the bank protests. And this is because they are continuing. Wells Fargo is continuing one of the biggest funders of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is going to make the Willow project in Alaska look like a little dwarf. And so that's why it's really important to keep up the pressure. So if you're interested, we're going to be, we don't have all the details yet, or we don't want to divulge the details, but we're going to be going to a local big bank and to say, hey, we don't approve of this. And so we'd love to have you join us. So save the date, January 31st. It's a Tuesday. It'll probably be like late morning to maybe about 1 o'clock, and we'll go to lunch after that together. All right, that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Goalie. What a great march this morning, the MLK March, and thanks so much for you and Raylene organizing that. Let's hear from Pat.
So Goalie pretty much said what I would say, which is that on January 31st, we'll have a reinstatement of the bank actions, and we have a really great action in the planning stages. Give me a call, either phone me or email me, and I would be glad to give you more information as it comes along. By early next week, we'll have solid information and would love for you to join us. So that's on the 31st in the morning. It'll be somewhere around 10:30 to 1, but don't hold down those exact times until you contact me, and we'll update you. So that's all I have to say. I guess I have one more thing. There's a group of us who are going to go to Washington, D.C. for an action at the Department of Energy for 3 days from February 6th through the 8th. And the purpose of that action is to put pressure on the Department of Energy to not allow permits for the next fossil pipelines and fossil projects that are planned for the Gulf. And the first one online, which is CP2, is planned to export fossil gas to Europe. And if it goes online, the world will go past its carbon budget, and there's no way that we're going to be able to keep the temperatures to the levels that were agreed on in the Paris Climate Accord. So it's critical that the Biden administration, specifically Secretary Granholm, not okay the permits. And if you're interested in going to that 3-day protest event in Washington, D.C., the 6th, 7th, and 8th of February, contact me. We have places to stay, and it'll be a very important action. So that's it for me. Check, pass it on to the next person.
Thank you, Pat. And let's wrap it up with Luke.
Okay. It's exciting to see this many people still hanging around here. Really, really nice. It's been a great evening. And I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that what do we do nonviolent direct action for? And that's to push the politicians to do something about the big businesses. Okay? That's what it's all about. And another way to push politicians is to elect good ones. So we're going to start up our Get Out the Vote program here at Third Act Sacramento for this very, very scary election year. And I put in the chat, I put the first little thing that we're doing, which is putting together a what can you do? So if you want to know what you can do as far as postcards or texting or walking or donating, you can you can get some hints there, and I hope people will look at it and can send me. I'll put my email in the chat. You'll send me other ways to help out in this election year. So thanks everybody. It's a great group, and we're real lucky to be working with the people we're working with. That's for sure.
Wow, I am stunned. We finished 3 minutes early. So for maybe I'm just going to limit it to folks who haven't yet come to a Third Act event. Maybe this is your first meeting with us. Do you have a question that you'd like to address to any of the folks who you've heard speak about? Any questions about how to get involved or why we do what we do or anything like that? Okay, well, I think everyone's officially exhausted. So I'm going to keep the Zoom on just for another second. If you want to, I think you're able to download the chat. You just go to the chat, and at the very bottom, you'll see 3 dots. And if you hover over those dots, there's a little thing that says more, and you click that, and then you just go to the top and you save the chat. So just in case you want someone's email, there's a lot of great information in there that we shared, but others shared as well. And I heard from a few of you who want to be added to the newsletter list. So if you want to take a minute, if you decide you want to be added, go ahead and put your name. And you can always get in touch with us at the email address thirdactsac@gmail.com. So thank you so much. It's been an exhilarating evening, and I wish you the very best for 2024. Good night, everybody.